it's a little early to test your immersion French or your core French, so I'll just tell you that the name of my organization, the organization I work with, is le Conseil de développement économique de l'Alberta, and it's a provincial organization that helps French-speaking entrepreneurs. The province is big, and we're only 10 people, and we have 4 little offices in Calgary, Edmonton, and in Grand Prairie and Bonnyville. And we try to be everything to everyone, and some days that's easier than others. The kinds of things that come up when I first started working there, my background's in social development, so economic development, you know, it's nice to move careers and to do something where it's a stretch, but sometimes it's like, you know, crossing the Grand Canyon is kind of like, I don't know this stuff. But the wonderful thing, and this conference really helps me with that kind of thing, is that I don't have to know everything, but I have to know where I can get information and who I can call and who I can talk to. And so I get a lot of help from Alberta Women Entrepreneurs. I get a lot of help from the Canada Youth Business Foundation. I get a lot of help from Business Link. And at this conference, one of the things that's really good for me is that when I'm sitting with people from Coaldale and Growth and Provo and different places, that I find out that some people feel alone too in different geographic areas, and it's really nice to come together and feel that we're all in much the same business, and that we can have an opportunity to hear, to get out of that. I find it something like cuisine, I'm not sure that translates in English, but you know, get out of the kitchen, out of the everyday sort of operations we do, and raise our heads a little bit, and hear people speaking about a bigger vision, about leadership, about Roger's presentation about how to market. It was just fantastic to laugh, to learn, to meet new people. It's been really, really great. And I want to thank you, Leanne, so much for the organization. I mean, it's not today. I mean, it started, months ago. The first messages come out. Everything's so well organized. There's not a beat that's missed, and I really appreciate all the work that you do, and I'm sure that it's not with a great team. I do want to tell you a couple of things about le Conseil de développement économique de l'Alberta. One of the things that we will be launching in the next couple of weeks is our 2013-14 French tourism guide that we market in Europe and in Quebec. We do trade shows and encourage French-speaking people who want to visit Alberta to come here. And it's interesting when Roger was saying, you know, paper, no more. And we've had that debate for the last 2 years. Do we print, do we not print, you know? And we decided to print one more year. But we're also working with the 3 other Western provinces, and we have an app for French language services, tourism services. So when people come here from France, from Belgium, from Quebec, they can have access to all kinds of information about where they can stay, museums they can visit, parks, what kinds of French language services are available to them. Some parks have direct services, others have audio kinds of things, others will do things with a reservation. Sometimes too, because their level of English, it may not be as very strong. It's really comforting for them to know that they can go to a hotel or to a bed and breakfast that has French-speaking staff, so at least they can relax and speak their language in the evening. So we try to, we couldn't do this by ourselves, but with the 4 Western provinces working together, we're developing the application, adding more information to it, and marketing it. So we're certainly trying to move into that area. One of the things that I really admire people who are good at things that I'm not good at, and they make it look so easy. I heard Todd speak last year, and it's one of the things that in terms of surveys and statistics and analysis that I'm not good at, but I just love it when somebody can take me by the hand and lead me through that. I remember years ago, probably dating myself here, but the first kind of introduction to that was Boom Bust Echo and Sex in the Snow and stuff like that. And it's really interesting to me, and it's not something that I could sit there with all those stats for 3 years and I would never come out with anything that makes any sense. So it's really nice to be walked through that and to have the benefit of your super bio, Todd. I mean, I'm really impressed. Your education, you're very sought after. And we're very fortunate to have you with us again this year. So thank you very much. And without further ado, Todd Hirsch.
Well, EDA, Spring 2013. Thank you so much again for having me come, and thank you for the introduction. And I do want to thank Leanne for being so accommodating with my schedule. I know I asked to be first, so I can be back in Calgary for something else that starts at 10 o'clock. So I do appreciate the flexibility, and Pat also for allowing me to go first. And it is very nice to be back with you folks. From my calculation, I think this is my 6th year. It's either 5 or 6, but I think it's my 6th year. And as I always say every year, I'm always honored to be invited to speak anywhere, but to be invited back 6 times, you know, it's getting to be habit forming. So this is one of the events that is a priority for me in my calendar every year, and I always am so honored and delighted to be back with you this year. The title of my presentation this morning, Alberta Economy in 2013, Faster is Not Always Better. And I think that might give a little bit of foreshadowing where I'm going with the presentation. On balance, I think, though, we have more good news than challenging news in this province. And I think on balance, you would agree that we are still very blessed in this province with an economy that is outperforming a lot of other places around the world. I like pictures of dogs, so I had to get this one in there. I like to drink out of the toilet, but I wasn't anticipating this complication. Now, if you like dogs, even if you don't like dogs, you might appreciate the predicament this little pooch has gotten himself into. I think sometimes, as a provincial economy, there are certain unanticipated situations or complications that might arise. I think in 2013, we may be experiencing some of these unanticipated situations. What I'm going to do this morning is, as I typically do, I'm going to walk us through what's going on in the global economy, talk about the always interesting things playing out around the world. We'll turn to the U.S. economy because, of course, you have to understand what's going on with the Americans to understand how it's influencing the Canadian economy. We'll talk about the broader Canadian economy, and then, of course, we will focus on this province. I'm going to outline some of the sectors that I think will be star performers this year. And then we'll maybe talk about some of those unanticipated situations that might be posing a little bit of a challenge or a little bit of a slowdown this year. So let's start then from the highest vantage point, the global perspective. What is going on with the global economy this year? I think it's fair to say that the level of anxiety in the global economy is less so than where it was maybe a year or certainly 2 years ago. About 2 years ago, there seemed to be this, everything was just on eggshells, waiting for, another big financial collapse and the global economy falling apart all over again. There is still a lot of concern, of course, but I think the level of anxiety is somewhat lessened. The OECD, they're saying that they're calling it a hesitant and uneven recovery over the coming 2 years. The good news is they're still calling it a recovery. In other words, the OECD is not expecting the global economy to take another downturn, another nasty recession. So things are still recovering. However, it will be hesitant and uneven. There are going to be some speed bumps along the way. Actually, when I was in Edmonton this week, I was calling them potholes because being from Edmonton, I've never seen potholes. Must have been just a nasty winter with the weather, but it's like driving on the moon. So there's going to be a few Edmonton-style potholes in the recovery. I'm sorry, I'm an Edmonton boy, so I'm allowed to say that. But there are going to be some potholes, some speed bumps along the way in the global recovery. One of the big speed bumps along the way, as always, will be the European Union. Now, the Europeans and the drama, it never seems to end there. Earlier this year, around January, February, I was talking about how things in Europe are kind of, coming together a little bit, less worried that it's all going to fly apart. And then, of course, there was an Italian election, and then, of course, there was the crisis in Cyprus, and once again, everything kind of spirals into this nervous fret of what's going to happen. Is the euro going to fraction? Are we going to see Cyprus exit the euro and set a dangerous sort of precedent for other countries leaving? As usual, I think it's just more kind of the uncertainty of what is happening in Europe that leads to all the concern and all the fear. I actually think that Europe will remain in recession, but I don't think it will fly apart. I think the euro currency will hold together. I think the euro, as a political unit, will hold together. I think over the last 3 or 4 years, they've proved themselves capable I mean, it's never a great situation, but they've proved themselves capable of at least bumbling their way through it. And I think 2013 will be a continuation of that. So, in other words, we won't be seeing any worst case scenarios with a fracturing of the euro and a collapse of the financial and banking system. However, the euro region, especially the southern Mediterranean countries, of course, will remain very challenged, will remain in recession this year. Some better news, let's talk about China. This is, as some of you may know, according to the Chinese horoscope, or the zodiac, this is the year of the snake. Now apparently snakes bring good luck. If you have a snake loose in your house, I guess you can experience good fortune. I don't know, most people might want to trade some bad luck rather than having a snake loose in their house. But the year of the snake is expected to bring some fortune, and we could in fact see China's economy with some good luck this year. About 6 or 8 months ago, there was some real concern among economists about China's economy slowing down a little too quickly. Now this was a big concern because of course China and the emerging Asian economies, they're still really the only pillar of growth in the global economy. If it wasn't for Asia right now, things would be much, much worse. And we need that sort of Asian engine to keep going. But there was some concern that China's economy might be heading towards what economists called a hard landing. In other words, things falling off too quickly and in fact leading to a global recession. Fortunately, most of the indicators now seem to suggest that China is headed more towards a soft landing. In other words, things are moderating, growth is slowing down, but it's going from double-digit growth rates of around 10 or 11% to probably something closer to 7, 7.5, 8%. The OECD, they're predicting 8.5% real GDP growth for China this year. Now, you don't have to look too hard. If you're a glass is half empty kind of person, if you want to be pessimistic, you don't have to look too hard at China to find something to worry about, especially the overbuild in the residential market. There are some real concerns. You don't want to sugarcoat this too much. However, I think the Chinese government, it still has enough fiscal gunpowder in the keg and monetary ability to prevent a worst case kind of scenario. European and North American governments, we don't have those tools available to us anymore. China still does, and that's why I'm reasonably confident that China will see that soft landing this year and will continue to be the one solid engine of growth in the global economy. Let's talk about our BFFs, our friends to the south of the United States. Well, the look on this eagle's face, you don't want to read too much into what an eagle is thinking. It's probably not thinking much at all. But if you were to... Oh, I don't mean anything negative about our American friends. I really didn't mean that. However you want to interpret it. But the expression on this bird's face is maybe a little bit of shock, maybe a little surprise, maybe in fact a little bit of anger. And I think all of those sentiments are sort of typical of what we're seeing in the US right now. In a lot of respects, politically, the United States is a very angry place. There's a lot of very, very bitter division, as we know, between the political parties, and sort of an inability to come together as political parties, the legislators in the US, to come to some agreements on how to deal with their very troubling deficit and debt situation. I think that will continue to be a theme that plays out in 2013. I think they'll kind of bumble through, but it's not going to be great, and the political infighting, I think, will continue to be a drag on Americans' confidence in their country. But the good news is, maybe the surprise look on the eagle's face, the good news is, in the background of all this political noise playing out, in the background, the US economy has actually been staging a pretty impressive comeback. Now again, you don't want to overstate this too much. This is not going to be a record-setting year. But most of the indicators, especially in the housing market, seem to be pretty favorable. Convincing evidence, anyway, that the US housing market is on a recovery track. Now, it had been a long time in coming, and of course it was the downturn in the US housing market that kicked off all the fun back in 2007, and in fact triggered the whole global downturn. But now the US housing market in 2012, and now that we're into 2013, is staging a comeback, and that should be very supportive of the US economy. Both because housing starts provide a lot of employment and construction jobs, but almost more so when the price of real estate starts to improve, Americans will feel more confident. Their asset price of their home is rising, so they're going to feel a little bit better off. That may encourage them to actually get out there and be better American consumers, which is what the US economy has been lacking. Business investment in the US, like in Canada, it's been very hesitant as well. Corporate America is sitting on a lot of cash. They're still waiting for more convincing evidence that consumers are coming back and that the economy is on the right track. But 2013, I think, is almost certain to be a better year for the US economy, one of the better ones that we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years. Let's talk about the Canadian economy, cute little cuddly Canada. Well, we were a bit of a darling coming out of the downturn in 2009 and 2010 when, in fact, the global economy remained in recession. Canada came bouncing back a little more quickly. And in fact, our recession here in Canada was shorter, and it was a little bit less painful. Our unemployment rate never really did reach those double digits like it did most other places. And as a result, Canada got a lot of sort of international attention for some of the policies that we did right. Our banking system, the soundest banking system in the world, and actions taken by the Bank of Canada were widely viewed as correct policy. However, in 2012, and now that we're into 2013, there has been a cooling off of the Canadian economy. And in fact, growth in Canada at the moment is lagging not only the United States, but also Japan. We're still ahead of Italy, fortunately, but in terms of our G8 peers, you know, Canada, we're no longer at the head of the pack. We're somewhere in the middle, maybe towards the bottom, in terms of growth. Now, the main challenge for the Canadian economy and the GDP has been our exports. They have been trickling off. And when our main export partners are buying less, or more to the point, when the price of what we're selling them is lower, I think you know where I'm going with that, that does have a drag on growth in Canada. Still, we're not looking at any kind of recession levels of growth, but we're only looking at kind of soft growth of maybe around 1.5% real GDP growth. Whereas the Canadian economy, the sort of potential growth would be around 3%. So we're growing at about half nationally, half the growth rate of what really would be an appropriate level of growth. The Bank of Canada, they're looking at the broader Canadian economy. They're a little bit concerned that they changed the wording in their most recent press release, which came March 6th. We're going to be seeing another one here in a week or so. But in the last press release from the Bank of Canada at the fixed announcement date, of course they didn't change that overnight rate. It remains at 1%. And no one expected them to alter that rate. But rather, it's the wording of these press releases that the Bank of Canada sends messages. And they changed the word, or they added a new phrase into this last press release. The phrase was all of this monetary stimulus that's in place. In other words, all these low interest rates, all this stimulus is going to remain in place for a period of time. That was the phrase that the market picked up on, very intentionally dropped in there by the Bank of Canada. The bank signaling to markets that interest rates are going to remain where they're at for an extended period of time. So don't be waiting for those rates to start rising anytime soon. Hard to imagine at this point why the Bank of Canada would need to raise interest rates. There's not a whiff of inflation. In fact, inflation is running about half of where the Bank of Canada would like it. It's actually too low, if you can imagine that. And a lot of spare capacity, a lot of slack in the Canadian economy. So my guess is that it'll be another 12, perhaps 18 months, in fact, before the Bank of Canada is going to be in a position to start raising rates. That, of course, means that for those households who have maybe accrued too much debt, they're still going to have a little bit of time. It's not going to be any sort of crisis yet nationally. They still have some time to kind of get their debt house in order. And when we do see rates start to rise, I think it will be gradual. However, we are in for an extended period of low borrowing costs, and when they do start to rise, it will be very slow. Anyone know what kind of bird this is? And don't say an owl. You have to be more specific. It's a great horned owl. And why is this bird maybe an appropriate bird? You saw my presentation. That's why. It's got all the right answers. Yes, this is the great horned owl. Yes, this is, well, you get full points. You did it homework. This is Alberta's provincial bird. Now, owls in general are quite astounding creatures. They can pivot their head 360 degrees and get a good view of everything. They can see in the dark, and they can also hear. Certain owls can hear a mouse moving under 4 feet of snow. It's really quite an amazing creature. And maybe it's appropriate that this is our provincial bird because Alberta's economy has been quite an impressive creature itself. We've been pretty used to, in Alberta, being among the fastest growing, maybe along with our sidekick Saskatchewan. But these two provinces are the growth engines of the country, and we're kind of used to playing that role. This is where all the economic momentum is. What I want to talk about this morning is the sectors that are expected to do well, or I'm expecting them to do well this year, and then maybe why we might see some slowdown, some sectors challenged perhaps a little bit. The forestry sector, I think this will be one of the stars. Now forestry, it lives under the shadow of the oil and gas sector, there's no question, but for a lot of those communities in western and northern Alberta, the forestry sector is a lifeblood of those communities, and probably a lot of you in this room understand that. Even though it's a smaller industry than oil and gas, it is an important contributor because it represents some pieces of diversity in Alberta's economy that maybe sometimes we lack. Forestry, for the last 10 years, it's been a tough slog for Canadian forest producers. It seems to have been a parade of bad news. It seemed if it wasn't mountain pine beetles or a trade spat with the Americans, it was a forest fire or the high Canadian dollar, it always seemed to be something beating them down. And as a result, over the last 10 years, we saw a real sort of consolidation or rationalizing of the industry. A lot of older mills that have been completely shuttered, but what's left of the industry, it's a smaller industry, but what's left is very lean and very efficient. And now we are seeing, for the first time in 5 years, lumber prices are taking off. For a lot of the reasons having to do with the housing market in the United States that I was talking about earlier, we're seeing demand for lumber and also panel board and oriented strand board and all those structural lumber products or forest products. Prices are really quite good. And that actually puts Alberta lumber mills and sawmills in good shape. They're seeing good prices, but they're also very lean and efficient, and I think forestry will be one of the leading sectors this year. Another leading sector, agriculture, and I like to talk about agriculture in my presentations. Probably I talked about it last year when I was here. Also maybe one of the unsung heroes of Alberta's economy. This farmer, he's out walking in his field. What I said was wheat, but I was taken aside by a farmer in Rimbey, and he said, no, it's barley. So, full confession, I'm a city boy. I'm surprised I can identify this as agriculture at all, but he's out walking in his field of barley. Unclear what he's really doing out there. Maybe he dropped his keys or something, but he's out there. He should be in a good mood these days, because grain and oilseed prices are still actually very, very good. They're not at the record highs they've been at certain other points, but grain and oilseed price is very solid. Going into 2013, the province is set to perhaps surpass the record-setting year in 2012 for farm cash receipts. Now, when I give this presentation around the province, any self-respecting farmer is certain to come up to me afterwards and tell me that, well, yeah, but input costs are crushing me. And that is always true. It's always going to be a tough slog for agriculture. There's always challenges. And of course, we always need Mother Nature to cooperate. But moisture levels around the province, we're only about maybe 4 or 5, depending on the region, 4 or 5 weeks away from seeding. Moisture levels seem to be, why is that not true? That's what they told me in Rimbey, for sale. Anyone here from Rimbey? Jerry's laughing. I'm really revealing myself as a city boy. I understand they put seeds in the ground. That still happens. I know they're technologically advanced, but they still, at some point, don't they have to put seeds in the ground? I do know that they need moisture levels to be just right. Can't be too dry or too wet. And it seems that moisture levels are expected to be pretty good. Now, it's a long time, and another self-respecting farmers will say you don't want to count it until it's in the bin, which I think is very sage advice. But given prices where they're at, and livestock prices, they've been a little bit uneven lately, but agriculture I do expect to be another one of the leading sectors. Finally, I want to talk about residential construction. Home building in Alberta this year, I think will come in only about average. So why is that a star sector? Why is that one of the good news stories? I think it's a good news story because home builders in the province have been a little bit more restrained. They have not been building at pedal to the metal rates like we saw in 06 and 07. And at that time, there were far too many homes being built. And then when the slowdown came in 2008, of course, there was a big hangover of inventory. And as a result, we saw prices for existing and new homes really take a big nosedive. In 2012 and 2013, I think home building is in much better balance. It's certainly held in there at quite steady levels the last 12 months. No real big ups or downs. And I think that kind of stability speaks to the balance in the housing market. both, again, existing home prices and new home prices, very stable. We saw new home prices from Stats Canada yesterday. A lot of balance in residential markets. Now, this is something that other parts of the country can't really talk about right now. Still a lot of worry about maybe some bubbles deflating in places like Vancouver and Toronto. And I think those are the markets that the CMHC and the federal government, they've been a little bit worried about them. And I think we're starting to see some of that price pullback in those markets. But in Alberta, the situation is different. Not really any signs of a bubble building. There's really only signs of a healthy, balanced market, perhaps with some room for prices to increase moderately, but nothing, I think, that will get out of control or that, in fact, will lead to any sort of bubble building and bursting. So, with all the good news, what could possibly go wrong? What could, in fact, set this province on a little bit of the different growth track? Well, here's where the presentation is going to get very, very technical. So if this is the global economy, and then we can do some labeling here, that might be Alberta, and Alberta's economy, that would be what could go wrong. That might be what comes flying off the fourth fairway and cracks us in the head. Now, I do want to state that this little situation here, I think, is overstating it. I'm not expecting Alberta's economy to crash and burn like this. But I guess I use this just as an example of there can be events that surprise us here in this province. And I think you know where I'm going next with the presentation. We do need to talk about oil prices and how they've been moving around. West Texas Intermediate, that's the North American benchmark price, of course, that we hear about on the news, or you pick up a newspaper. Those prices being quoted right now about $94 US a barrel. That's been pretty stable, by the way. Lower, of course, than the world price, that Brent price, because of a little bit of a glut in the US. But overall, North American benchmark price has been pretty stable. However, that, as we know, is not the price we receive here in Alberta. The benchmark price here is better reflected by that Western Canadian Select blend. And those prices generally have traded at that discount, a differential, as we all talk about now. I'm always amazed, by the way, how new terms or lexicon sort of picks up in the language. Even my mom now is talking about the differential. 5 years ago, no one other than oil traders talked about the differential. But now everyone seems to know and understand what this is and why this is a problem. Because certainly before Christmas, that differential had blown up to, at certain points, as high as $40 a barrel, about a 50% discount. And that led, of course, to a lot of worry, a lot of concern, a lot of uncomfortable planning for not only the provincial government, but the energy sector. Now, since this time, of course, that differential has again narrowed, and in fact, right now, it's actually quite narrow, around, I understand, around $10 or $12. Narrower, in fact, than the 10-year average. So that differential, it widens and it narrows at different points. But the point is that it is always unpredictable where that differential is going. And of course, it makes it difficult for this province to do any sort of planning or expectations around prices that our producers are going to receive. Well, why is there a differential at all? This little girl, or maybe it's a boy, I don't know, it's a bit of an androgynous little character, but let's call it a girl. This little girl, she knows her economics. She's saying to her mom, "You're sure this won't mess up the economy?" Well, it is in fact going to mess up the economy, at least the market for kittens in her block, because she's about to dump onto the market a box of free kittens, and this is going to lead to a crash in the price of kittens. Well, in Alberta, of course, we're not concerned about kittens. It's more this, North Dakota shale oil, which has been wreaking some havoc with prices here in Canada. Much more North Dakota shale, which, by the way, they're not giving away for free. But there's been an increase in supply, sort of an unanticipated increase over the last 3 years of North Dakota shale oil coming from other parts of the US, from Texas, that they were not sort of planning on. And as a result, prices for North America, for Canadian oil, have been somewhat depressed. That's why we're seeing that differential blowing up a little bit. How long is this going to last? How much shale oil is there in North Dakota? Really difficult to say. There was that report from the EIA about two months ago that caused a lot of worry. Basically, it was saying, the US is going to be self-sufficient in oil production by the year 2020. You can just see the blood draining out of a lot of faces in downtown Calgary, because this is really bad news if that in fact happens. I don't know, I think it's a report that every Albertan should maybe pay attention to, but I don't think we should be hitting a panic button just yet. What the EIA is doing is they're basically saying, well, if you extrapolate with a straight line the growth rate of production over the last 3 years, and you kind of draw that straight line out to the year 2020, here's where you're going to get. Well, I think a lot of you understand straight line forecasting isn't maybe always the best way to do things, and a lot can happen between now and 2020 that may not in fact lead those forecasts to be correct. Again, I think it's important that Alberta understand the U.S. is not always going to be there necessarily to buy our oil, but I don't think we need to panic too much about it right now. Another reason for that differential, of course, has to do with the pipeline system itself. Now here I've kind of sketched in some of the major oil pipeline corridors in North America, out to the Pacific coast, to the Gulf Coast, and of course the East Coast. And there are some proposals, of course, as we're all aware of, to increase pipeline capacity. Probably the most notorious or the most commonly talked about, the Keystone XL pipeline. A lot of controversy around this pipeline in the United States, and of course our Premier has been down in Washington about 4 times in the last little while promoting the pipeline and maybe dispelling some of the myths and trying to encourage American legislators and Mr. Obama particularly for approval of the Keystone XL pipeline. But at this point, it's still uncertain as to if that pipeline will be approved or not. There's no guarantees. However, there are other alternatives. There is the Northern Gateway pipeline, probably even more controversial and more opposition to this pipeline, at least from an environmental perspective. A lot of resistance in the province of British Columbia. A lot of people there are saying, well, what's in it for us? And potentially with the change of government in BC in May, I'm not expecting that pipeline to be received too warmly, or the proposal to be received too warmly. Probably even less certainty that the Northern Gateway pipeline will be approved. However, there are still other alternatives, there are other options. There is a possibility to reverse that Enbridge pipeline that runs currently from Montreal, headed west into Sarnia, Ontario, bringing imported, higher-priced oil into the port of Montreal and to Sarnia. There's the potential to reverse the flow of that, which I'm not a pipeline engineer either. Not only am I not a farmer, I'm not an engineer. It's not as easy as just hitting a switch, and now we can send it the other way. There's a lot more to it than that. But there is the potential to reverse the flow of that pipeline and carry Western Canadian oil for the first time across the Ottawa River into Montreal and to some of the underutilized refineries in that city. Another option that may make some really good sense is converting a natural gas pipeline in the province of New Brunswick to carry heavy oil from Western Canada to the port of St. John, New Brunswick, which is a really nice deep water port, easy for tankers to get in and out of there, unlike Kitimat, which is the biggest problem with the Northern Gateway. St. John is a very easy deep water port. There is the largest refinery in the country, the Irving refinery in St. John. And right now it is receiving and refining higher priced imported oil. If we could reverse or convert that natural gas pipeline, build additional pipeline through Quebec, again, we could be getting Canadian oil to Canadian refineries, lower priced Western Canadian oil. Might seem to make a lot of sense. Other options, the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline, which would be technically probably the easiest to accomplish, because really Kinder Morgan just wants to twin an existing pipeline, the corridor which is already there. However, this pipeline too, a lot of resistance in the city of Vancouver. A lot of people in that city not really sure they want to see oil tanker traffic in their port quadruple over the next 10 years. Other alternatives, sending more by rail, possibly to ports in Alaska or even Churchill, Manitoba. And we have been seeing oil tanker traffic moving by rail tanker, almost increased tenfold over the last few years. Still only carrying about 5% of oil, but we do see that as some potential there to move more oil out of the province. You see the trend with all of these projects, it's trying to get landlocked Alberta resources to tidewater, where we can then get access to higher price international markets, or at least into other refineries in perhaps Quebec or in the US. Uncertain if any of these projects are going to go ahead, but I think there's some certainty that at least enough of these projects will, in some way or shape or fashion, that in fact, I don't know if we need to worry too much about that bitumen bubble. I think we need to worry a little bit about it. We can't assume forever that resource prices are going to save us and bail us out. But I don't know if we need to be reading the obituaries yet for Alberta's energy or our oil sands economy, because I do think enough of these projects in some fashion will proceed. One more picture of a dog. When my mom tells me to get in my kennel, I pretend to be paralyzed so she has to carry me. I always say, my dog can never see this picture. It'll fill her mind with terrible ideas, and she'll try this, I'm sure she will. Alberta's economy at certain points in the past, there has been paralysis. I think it's fair to say that early 1980s period, some of you in the room look old enough to remember that. I, in fact, graduated from high school just at the peak of sort of that downturn. June 1984, the unemployment rate in Edmonton was 12.8%. That is paralysis. You know, certain points in the mid-90s, some recession years there, even as recent as 2009, when this province, its economy contracted by 5.1%. Now that paralysis turned out to be very, very short-lived. In fact, I always say if you happen to be taking an extended nap one afternoon, you might have missed the whole thing, because the recession, it was very pronounced, but fortunately very short-lived, and the economy bounced back in 2010 and 2011. 2013 is not going to be paralysis whatsoever. It is not going to be 1984 or 1996 or even 2009. But we will be seeing a moderation in Alberta's economy this year. 2011, the province was now growing by 5.1%. 2012, we don't have the final numbers in from Stats Canada, but the provincial economy moderated maybe to around 3.5%. 2013, I think we will see another moderation, with growth coming in probably around 2.8 or 3%. Now, this is where I like to caution us as Albertans, because I think in 2013 we need to brace ourselves for a lot of negative media reports about layoffs coming, about projects being delayed or postponed or even canceled. The temptation is to read these headlines and think, oh no, it's all fallen apart. Everything is paralyzed once again, and everything's going down into the sewer. Anything but that case. In fact, some moderation is, in fact, probably healthy. And that's where the title of the presentation comes back. Faster is not always better. If you're Greece or Spain or California, yeah, faster is better. You need your growth to pick up. In Alberta, actually, we needed some moderation, and we're seeing a healthy level of slowdown. A lot of places around the industrialized world would love to see a forecast of 2.5 or 3% growth. But in this province, it is going to feel a little bit slow. It is going to feel a little bit soft. But I think we will remain a very healthy, well-balanced economy this year. So with that, once again, just some information there. I love it. If you want to follow me on Twitter, and I'll follow you back. Big user of social media that way. Do we have time for questions? If there are any questions, I would love to entertain some. And I do apologize in advance, because the minute I step off this podium, I'm going to get in my car, so I'm not going to have a chance to sort of to stay around the rest of the day and visit with you. But if there are any questions now, I'd love to try to answer them. Yes, sir.
I got one, Todd. What I want to know is, are you going to follow the lead of Mr. Carney and go to England for that big job when he retires?
Well, my phone, there's a lot of messages on my phone from the Bank of England. I'm not sure what they're about. No, central banking, you know, they'd never recruit me anyway, but central banking is a very strange game, and I had the opportunity to work at the Bank of Canada for about 4 years. Amazing place to get some great experience, but it is a totally different world. I'm not really cut out for central banking, so I'll have to turn them down if they do ask me. Yes? Hi.
The provincial government budget, internal in Alberta, has created some of the negativity that you're talking about from a media coverage perspective, and kind of that challenge of how people are responding to that.
Yeah.
But my understanding is that from a national perspective, or even from beyond that, this is viewed as actually bringing some restraint into government spending that's important for Alberta for the long term. Can you comment on that?
Well, I have to be a little bit careful like how I comment about working for a Crown corporation. I don't want my boss getting a phone call from Mr. Horner's office, which could happen. I don't know. No, I mean the provincial government. It's a tough slog being the finance minister, and you know I think really more of the responsibility rests on the shoulders of Albertans. I still look at Albertans and we seem to want it both ways here. We don't want to talk about, don't you dare talk about a sales tax or any kind of increase in revenue. But don't you dare cut funding to hospitals or universities. You know, we want it both ways, and I think there is a recognition that we have to come off this fool's paradise and understand how are we going to finance this. We can't keep relying, and every party, every Albertan agrees, we cannot keep burning through our energy royalties and depending on them that way. But then the question becomes, how do we have that conversation about how do we bridge the gap? How do we look at accepting maybe lower government spending or maybe increases in revenue? How is that for politically correct?
Sorry, Todd.
Sure.
I think my point was that outside of Alberta, this was actually viewed as a good budget because the object of how rapidly we were, or how much our spending, our government spending had been going over time was pretty significant. And so to bring that back into line is actually giving Alberta a better position from an outside optic.
Well, yeah, certainly from the outside optics, I think, you know, maybe it's hard to cry a lot of tears for poor Alberta. You know, we're bleeding poverty. We've got 4.5% unemployment. I think the rest of the country and the rest of the world might be looking at Alberta and saying, yeah, absolutely, you need to show a little bit of restraint in your spending, for sure. Yeah, it's a good point. Yes?
Is government debt necessarily a bad thing?
No, not at all. Just like household debt isn't necessarily a bad thing. And right at the moment, you know, how the rates that the Alberta government can borrow at, in some ways, they'd be foolish not to take advantage of this. You know, they're almost giving money away for free to borrow money if you're the Alberta government. So no, not all government debt is bad. The only thing that can be bad is when it becomes habit forming. And no government sets out starting to run deficits, anticipating we're going to run 20 years of, you know, ballooning deficits. This is the problem Ottawa got into in the early 1970s. They started to run it at, you know, a couple years of deficit, and it becomes habit forming, you know, and Alberta's fought those demons in the past. I'm absolutely not opposed to the deficits that we're seeing now, the borrowing, but we do need to understand, okay, when though then does this end? You know, and I think maybe that's what some of the opposition parties have been saying is, okay, but do we have a plan then for returning to surplus, or is this now the slippery slope? And I think it's the slippery slope of debt addiction, that's the problem. But government borrowing is not necessarily bad at all. Silence falls across the room. Everyone's waiting for Pat's presentation. Any other questions? As always, I mean, if you don't, I know I do get a chance to meet with a lot of you as I travel around the province, so before too long I might show up in one of your communities and I would love to sort of reconnect with you. Or if you do have questions or if you want to invite me out to your communities, you can easily do that through my website or through my contact at ATB Financial. But with that, if there are no other questions, I'll turn it back over to Jerry. Thank you so much.